Good evening. Thank you for coming this evening. First, my heartfelt thanks to Professor Abbasid for that incredibly generous introduction. I'm humbled and very grateful, particularly to be speaking here before this world-renowned program in Iranian studies, which is so very distinguished. Professor Ramazani has done extraordinary work to build it over the years and build its renown really across the world. So it's, I'm particularly as a scholar of Anglophone poetry and poetics, I feel a little bit like a fish out of water here, but I hope for that reason that you, Professor Mirani, and the rest of you who are in Iranian studies will forgive the inadequacies of a newcomer to this area. In any case, it's wonderful to be back at Stanford, and I want to also thank the English department, creative writing, and Jewish studies for co-sponsoring, and it's really great to see long-cherished friends here and to be meeting and making new friends as well during this trip. I start with a picture of what was, before last year's election, the world's most famous wall, though I hope to show that walls are not always what they seem. This talk's going to be in 3 parts of unequal length, so don't get too worried, across the hour or so. And the first looks at the Persian influences on modern Irish poet that have passed largely unrecognized. A bridge taken for a wall. The second looks at a Persian poet whose accessibility in English has perhaps been overestimated, a wall taken for a bridge. And the third attempts a synthesis in another Persian poet who can help us think, about the arts as both bridge and wall. And in my conclusion, I'm going to offer a few reflections briefly on the place of lyric poetry in world literature. So, for this first section, I've been writing across my career about the preeminent Irish poet W.B. Yeats, but it wasn't until my Iranian-born father, it was very kindly spoken about just now by Professor Mirani. He was dying last fall, and the tide of anti-Iranian, anti-Muslim xenophobia was rising. I awoke to a previously undetected Persian undercurrent that flows into Yeats's work. Indeed, I think as we try to transnationalize our cultural paradigms of the humanities, and my field explore more fully modernism's engagement with Asian, African, Pacific Islander, and other cultures, Iran's been left almost entirely out of the picture, as it has been largely out of world literary studies as well. Critics have written about Yeats's other Asian interests, to take my prominent example here, particularly Japanese and in Indian culture, including collaborations with figures like Mohini Chatterjee, Tagore, Sri Purabhitswamy, Yoni Noguchi, Junzo Sato, and others, but not the Persianist Yeats. I want to confront straight away a reason why this idea might seem improbable. Those of you who know Yeats might be frowning, thinking, how could you be saying this? Namely, his lauding the Greek defeat of the Persians in the second stanza of his great late poem called The Statues. By virtue of the superiority of artists like Phidias. He says, no greater than Pythagoras, for the men that with a mallet or a chisel modeled these calculations that looked like casual flesh, put down all Asiatic vague immensities. So he's talking about this defeat of the Persian armies at Salamis, and basically it's Greek form that helps to defeat the Asiatic many-headed foam at Salamis, as he calls it here. So I guess you could make an argument to the dean for the value of the humanities on the basis of this, look, we can defeat armies, but obviously it's somewhat as someone whose parentage is mostly Iranian, Muslim on one side, Zoroastrian on the other. Here, to put up here a picture of my great-grandfather, Abbasid, the representative for Zoroastrians in Parliament. So if you're from that background, you might feel dismayed by a stanza like this of Yeats that I started off with, since it updates the notion that my ancestors were the original barbarians. Their unintelligible speech, sounding to at least to the ancient Greeks, like an echoic and nonsensical ba 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 that marked them as the uncivilized other, especially after the Greco-Persian wars. I always wonder, what were they actually saying? Baradar and Nuni Barbari, what was it that they heard? Anyway, a nearly exact contemporary of Yeats, Abab Khosrow, it's just remarkable. This 1 year difference. Oh, you can't see the date there. Fix that. There we go. So you can see they're almost exact contemporaries. He had just recently built the mausoleum for Ferdowsi, author of Iran's great epic poem Shahnameh, at the time when Yeats was disparaging Persian formlessness. If, like me, as a 15-year-old kid who stood at Iran's ancient capital, Persepolis, and were awed by the sculptural precision and formal patterning still visible there after 2.5 millennia, let alone the intricate metalwork many of us have seen in places like the British Museum, Yeats's contrast between the Greek sculptural precision and a Persia of Asiatic vague immensities, again, may seem problematic. Iranians, of course, have been receiving bad press in the West ever since the ancient Greeks wrote the victor's history, not long after the battle at Salamis. To understand this broad cultural put-down, emphasized there by the enjambment of the third line, the almost inevitable framework, I suppose, is Edward Said's Orientalism. As Said writes, Orientalism produces and reinforces a series of oppositions by which the West defines itself, and Orientals, of course, are always symmetrical to, he says, and yet diametrically inferior to a European equivalent. Yeats dichotomizes in his work the heroic individualized West as against the Asian, formless, many-headed East. So having begun with this hardest case, though, I want to show that it's relatively atypical of Yeats and inconsistent with many of his poems. Yeats's engagements with Persian culture can help us to see that while the Orientalist model remains valuable, it's possible, as I've argued elsewhere for Eliot Pound and other modernists, for Orientalists also to be anti-Orientalists. And if so, perhaps we can continue to learn about intercultural exchange from these poets' intermittent dialogue with Asian cultures, even that of the original barbarians. So why is Yeats open to such dialogue? I think the early inspiration of Mohini Chatterjee, we saw earlier, the transnational mysticism of theosophy, the shared sense of the Irish as being on the receiving end of empire, all of these and other factors likely played a part. In comments across his career, which I put up here, Yeats frequently suggests A, that Ireland and Asia have a common ancestry, B, that East and West have influenced one another over thousands of years, and C, whether they came about through shared ancestry or influences, the resemblances between Ireland and Asia are profound. Even the statues, that poem that I began with, complicates its East-West binaries with contrary views. It crams into the third stanza hundreds of years of our history in which East and West crossings even fused. As the Greek Empire extended into West and South Asia, Hellenistic sculptural forms were indigenized in Greco-Buddhist sculptures, he draws our attention to here, that are both idealist and realist, as in the Gandharan style. Yeats champions the Buddhist embrace of the fundamental reality of emptiness. The middle of this middle stanza here, middle of the stanza, empty eyeballs, new that knowledge increases unreality, that mirror on mirror mirrored is all the show. Like the meditating Hindu ascetics on Mount Meru, and another poem, the enlightened one, strips away all illusion and sees into what Yeats calls the desolation of reality. Elsewhere, Yeats sees a Greco-Persian confluence in the Persianized work of Callimachus, the great Greek sculptor, celebrated in the middle stanza of a poem that straddles east and west, Lapis Lazuli. So if the Persians were seen as the enemies of form in the statues, Yeats nevertheless credits them in his long systematic work of vision with being the creators of forms that are central to his idealized Byzantium. He's especially attracted to what he calls, to that decoration that seems to undermine our self-control and is, it seems, of Persian origin, and has for its appropriate symbol a vine whose tendrils climb everywhere and display among their leaves all those strange images of bird and beast, those forms that represent no creature eye has ever seen, yet are begotten one upon the other, as if they were themselves living creatures. It's hard not to hear in this passage his interest in self-replicating, non-mimetic forms begotten one upon the other, a precursor for the lines in one of Yeats' most famous poems, Byzantium, about self-generative forms, flames begotten of flame, gloriously self-sufficient and independent of the natural world. The multiply and ecstatically echoic diction and sounds in the poem Byzantium evoke a patterning that surpasses nature, just as modern artists like Picasso, this painting, Kandinsky, spent a year in Tunisia, 1904-05. Matisse, the same period. This is a picture I took from the recent exhibit about his interest in Morocco, Algeria, and Andalusia, were influenced by abstractive, non-Western forms. Yeats's intricately patterned poems build on the idea of the non-representational, self-replicating Persian forms embedded in Byzantine art. Increasingly, we're coming to understand modernist styles not as merely appropriating, but as being constituted by such non-Western forms. And I think an important and unappreciated part of that story is the crucial ingredient of Persian art and architecture. In keeping with the work of the Austrian art historian who repeatedly cites, Josef Strykovsky, Yeats sees the non-representational lines, patterns, and creatures in Byzantine mosaics to be of Persian origin, such as those that profoundly affected Yeats on his travels to Ravenna in 1907 and Sicily in 1925. Although his vision of Byzantium as a site of blending of East and West is frequently acknowledged, yes, less fully embraced is the idea of a specifically Iranian influence. Indeed, at least one critic is exasperated by the idea, grousing, Yeats is too dependent on Strykovsky's obsession with the supposed Persian origin of Byzantine art. Strykovsky knew, of course, that to make a claim for Iranian and Mesopotamian influences on the Byzantine Empire was sure to meet, as it says here, with hostility and prejudice. But he pointed in Italian mosaics to what he thought was an older influence, which, in my opinion, must be connected with Iran and more particularly with Mazdian ideas. Although Strykovsky's work is eccentrically morphological and his later politics are deplorable, he helped push art history in a global direction, as historian Suzanne Marchand has recently argued. Challenged, she says, Eurocentrism and attacked the classicizing elitism of the art historical establishment, which failed to give the Orient, she says, sufficient credit for its independent inventions. Right, everything's always been traced back to the classical Roman and Greek heritage. Yeats also acknowledges the Iranian conceptual basis that Strykovsky identifies with semi-abstract forms, suggesting of his copy of an old Persian carpet that its winding, not that carpet, but one like that, that its winding and wandering line had once that philosophical meaning which has made it very interesting to Yosef Tchaikovsky and was part of the religion of Zoroaster. In Tchaikovsky's view, pre-Islamic Iran affords Byzantine art what he calls anti-representational forms rooted in the Zoroastrian idea, particularly of farena, or glory, the propulsive force of life associated with the creator god, Ahura Mazda. Farena, he says, is the power that makes running waters gush from springs and even governs the courses of sun, moon, and stars. What form specifically does this Iranian life force take in art? Well, the miraculous bird is prominent among Iran's unnatural beasts. The bird Faregan or Faregna, writes Tchaikovsky, is the vehicle Farena, or glory. The glory flew forth in the likeness of a bird, he quotes from the Abbasid. Supernatural fowl resembles other magical Iranian birds such as Simor and Simur. Just as Yeats conceives the continuous vine as Persian, he would have known from Tchaikovsky that a bird made by Grecian goldsmiths in 6th century Byzantium to keep a drowsy emperor awake, as he says in Sailing to Byzantium, may have borne Iranian traces. So too the emphatically non-naturalistic 10th century bird of Byzantium. These are some pictures I took of in a museum in Berlin. But here's that stanza from Byzantium. Recalls the Persian prototype that Tchaikovsky emphasizes, miracle bird or golden handiwork, that may scorn aloud in glory of changeless metal, common bird or petal, and all complexities of mire or blood. Describing Italian mosaics, such as those Yeats saw in Ravenna and Sicily, Tchaikovsky attributes the general scheme to Iranian influences. And here, I'm sorry, I'm going to take you, it's almost going to be like my excuse to do what art historians always do, turn off the lights down and show you for their travels. Well, anyway, I spent some time in Ravenna, so I get to do that a little bit here. He talks about motifs in the form of a vase between birds, or whole landscapes with sheep or stags by the side of a shepherd and flanked by palms, or as the tomb of Galatacidia, a cross with a starry background, features that, he says, Tchaikovsky seem to indicate an Eastern origin, and the supposition is confirmed by the decoration of adjacent barrel vaults and apses, with vine scrolls, acanthus scrolls, and figures of stags at water springs, and colors suggested by birds' plumage. Similarly, the Church of San Vitale also has farena symbols in the roof's mosaics, converging tree designs forming a circle, the intermediate spaces being filled by continuous scrolls enclosing a large number of birds and animals. So for Tchaikovsky, other non-representational elements, such as the interlaced geometric patterns and scrollwork and capitals, are distinctly Iranian. So, to specify, I think, this Persian strand in Byzantium is to give the generality of the idea of Byzantium as offering an East-West fusion, more precise in the cultural force. So, although I've been emphasizing the pre-Islamic Zoroastrian elements of Persian culture, believed to be manifest in Byzantine art, Persian culture was also a central influence, of course, on Arab Muslim culture, particularly during what is often called, or I realize this term is now disputed, the Golden Age of Islam. Except for the Byzantium poems, the place name Byzantium appears in only one other of Yeats's poems, The Gift of Harun al-Rashid. Despite the popular image of Yeats's poetry is focused almost exclusively on Ireland, one of the longest poems he wrote in maturity reimagines the intellectual learning and cultural splendor under this Abbasid caliph as a context within which to dramatize the beginnings of his marriage. It's a dramatic monologue which unfolds an epistolary poem, which includes a dialogue poem, frames within frames, genres within genres that recall the layering of the Persian queen Shahrazad's recitations in the poem's prototype, 1,000 Nights, the amalgam of Middle Eastern and South Asian narratives that Yeats said most moved him after Shakespeare. His semi-historical narrative refers to intercultural exchange between Baghdad and Byzantium as the doctor and translator Gustav M. Lucca, who historically actually came a little bit later, but we'll forgive that anachronism here, instructs an unnamed messenger to carry this letter past the caliph's dark banners inscribed with calligraphy, past Sappho, to pause at the treatise of Parmenides and hide it there for caliphs to world's end, must keep that perfect as they keep her song, so great its fame. Early Greek works that are later known only in fragments, of course, are still whole in the caliph's library. In a note originally accompanying the poem, Yeats defends his taking poetical license, as he calls it, to imagine that this great philosophical work, of which we possess only fragments, may have found its way into an Arab library of the 8th century. Islamic learning was, of course, crucial to the preservation of ancient Greek texts, an Eastern detour that Yeats foregrounds, but sometimes forgotten in narratives of the seemingly unbroken line of transmission of the Western heritage. What at least used to be called, again, the Golden Age of Islam, saw the development of institutions of scientific, medical, philosophical, cultural learning, such as the House of Wisdom, founded in Baghdad by Harun al-Rashid, which brought together Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars. In both the poem and his note to it, Yeats refers to the historical execution of the Caliph's vizier, Ja'far, in 803, saying he had been the head of the family of Byzantium, an important family of advisors of Persian Buddhist origin in the Caliph's court. Add to this cross-cultural mix Lucca's reference to the great Harun al-Rashid, born and raised in Iran, near Tehran, as sometimes occupied with Persian embassy or Grecian war, and in the poem's first printing, the letter's addressee, later fictionalized as Abdal Rabban, meaning the rabbi, was Fereshteh, angel, in Persian, the equivalent of, say, Angelo. And the poem's narrator is a Christian, or as he puts it, someone who has accepted the Byzantine faith. Arab, Persian, Greek, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Byzantine. This is a world of manifold cross-cultural intersections. Yeats conveys something of the spirit of a medieval Muslim world in which peoples of different faiths, working across different languages, collected and advanced world thought and culture in what seems, at a time when much of Europe, anyway, seemed a relative backwater. Postcolonial scholars such as Robert J.C. Young have rightly conceptualized medieval Cordova as such a transnational and transcultural site under Islam. But Abbasid, Baghdad came several centuries earlier, of course. Like Byzantium, Cordova, Yeats's Baghdad exemplifies an East-West cosmopolitanism that's far from an Orient presumed, in Edward Said's words, backward, degenerate, uncivilized, and retarded. As in Byzantium and even in Greece, Yeats sees within Harun al-Rashid's caliphate a dialogue of civilizations, even as his own poem enacts it. Two of his other poems are written in the voice of specific of biblical figures, Solomon and Sheba, and Solomon and the Witch. Reimagining himself as the Arab Solomon, a prophet who can speak with animals and control jinns and the wind, he gives a philosophical disquisition on the painful difference between one's imagined image and the real image of the beloved, and on the extraordinary blessing of unifying these two images when choice merges with chance. Such poems attribute robust intellectual capacities to the Muslim Middle East. Moreover, far from portraying Arab femininity as passive and veiled, the poem ends with an assertion of female sexual agency, Sheba crying out, "O Solomon, let us try again." Although even these poems betray some of the same Orientalism I began with, the sense of costuming, the historical mistakes, and so forth, I hope I've assembled enough countervailing evidence that Yeats isn't only an Orientalist. Instead, he recalls the exception to Orientalism that Said carves out, albeit all too briefly, for two French writers, Nerval and Flaubert, whose work is complicit in Orientalism, he says. It remains independent from it in its idiosyncrasies and unresolved tensions. Although Said narrowly restricts his frame of exception to these two writers, it should be expanded, I think, with other figures like Eliot, Pound, Matisse, Kandinsky, and Yeats. A poet who, like Said's Frenchman, engages Persian and Arab culture and art through an eccentrically personal prism without seeking Orientalist domination or documentation. Whereas we might have thought of Yeats's poetry, again, as an Orientalist wall that harshly closes off the Middle East and degrading stereotypes, we can see it at least as, in part as an anti-Orientalist bridge, an important, if largely unrecognized conduit for Persian-influenced non-representational form and Abbasid multiculturalism into English language poetry and culture. So with that, and those are my kids, an excuse for, again, for more family photographs. Part two, a wall taken for a bridge, and briefly slide out of this. So, although I'm going to stay with medieval Muslim art and culture, this time late in the era of the Abbasid Caliphate, I'd like to shift the focus from Persian art to poetry, juxtaposing our 20th century Irish poet, whose Persian influences have passed largely unacknowledged, with a 13th century Persian poet, this hokey version of what he might have looked like, whose accessibility in the West may sometimes be exaggerated. Despite my general preference for bridges over walls, there are risks to mistaking a wall for a bridge, to thinking we're crossing over but may still be stuck on the same side. Rumi, or Maulana, or Molavi, as he's known in Persian, is a best-selling poet, of course, sometimes thought to be the best-selling poet in the English language, much better selling, in fact, than W.B. Yeats, a fellow mystic with Neoplatonist leanings. Whereas Yeats was amazed when a volume of his poetry sold 2,000 copies, by far his biggest sale. Coleman Barks has sold 2 million copies of his Rumi translations, or to be more precise, after I bought this copy on Amazon, 2,001,001. Rumi's poetry would seem to be the perfect example of world literature understood in David Damarsh's terms as writing that gains in translation. In this case, it gains in market share and readers 800 years after Rumi's birth. But can Rumi's work help us think critically about this model while granting its usefulness and foregrounding how texts circulate transnationally? What's suppressed when we overestimate such gains? So detective work turned up some material indications in my university library of what Rumi gains in translation. Someone's drawn a box and ink around these lines. This is how I would die into the love I have for you, as pieces of cloud dissolve in sunlight. Facing page, Barks's translated excerpts continue on the theme of love, understood in secular rather than in sacred terms, of course, and someone has pressed a flower to leave its impression on the page near the lines. Love is the mother, we are her children. In another poem, we read statements like these, and these purveying wise statements and memorable figure of language. These are the kinds of lines that circulate, of course, through greeting cards, email signature lines, t-shirts, popular songs, and other media, in accord with the epidictic or broadly truth-telling strand that Jonathan Cullors recently reaffirmed in the lyric. In so doing, Rumi's popular translators often, of course, de-Islamize him in the scholar Anne-Marie Schimmel's verb, combing out his Muslim-specific content, such as terms like Allah and Huri. I avoid God words of Barks and vows because they seem to take away the freshness of the experience. He's hardly alone, of course, in this regard. Lawrence Venuti writes, translations inevitably perform a work of domestication. And so Venuti objects to translations seen as suppressing the linguistic or cultural difference of the foreign text. and wholly assimilating it to dominant values in the target language culture. Similarly, Gayatri Spivak criticizes the translation of third world texts into a sort of with-it translationese that seems fully accessible, warning of a species of neo-colonialist construction. This gain in translation would seem to require significant losses. Under such asymmetries of power, Barks's de-Islamized Rumi risked being colonized Rumi. Whereas Barks's conventional free verse translations have had little of an impact on the development of poetry in English, nearly a century earlier, a friend and collaborator of Yeats, Ezra Pound, recreated the Chinese poet Li Bai's work in crystalline, image-studded lyrics that broke open new possibilities for the development of imagism, modernism, free verse. A translator of poetry in Chinese, Anglo-Saxon, Occitan, French, Italian, Latin, and other languages, Pound exemplifies how generative the labor of translation can be, of course, for poets. Even after decades of translation theory, which I've been immersed in over the last year or so, I still think, after all that we've seen over the last several decades, it's still worth remembering his distinctions between aspects of poetry that are easily translated and those that are not. As he says here, that part of your poetry which strikes upon the imaginative eye of the reader will lose nothing by translation into a foreign tongue. That which appeals to the ear can reach only those who take it in the original. In his famous tripartite division, phanarpia, he makes up these terms, can be translated almost or wholly intact, right? That visual dimension. Melopia, in which words are charged in meaningful ways, can be appreciated in an unknown foreign language, but with small exceptions, he says, it is practically impossible to transfer or translate in one language to another. Similarly, logopia, his third term, or wordplay on connotations and associations, he says, does not translate. Translations by Pound and Barks convey, of course, then the poet's visual images, metaphors, narratives, tonal shifts, meaning, parables, and themes, but some aspects of the originals elude even the most skillful translators. Even scholars who are true to the religious context of Rumi's poetry, such as Javid Mojadedi, can only hint at Rumi's logopia or melopia, the latter including varieties of tajnis and other kinds of laughs in Perso-Arabic poetics. Take the facing page bilingual, Say Nothing, poems 2008, poems ably translated by Iraj Anvar and Twitty, which includes one of the first classical poems I fell in love with when learning to read Persian poetry in my 20s, a ghazal on the theme, Sufi theme, classic Sufi theme of dissolution or fanon, from the Divan Shams Tabriz. You can hear in the opening matba, or form second couplet, how richly patterned and musically recursive is the Persian of Rumi's 11-syllable hemistichs and hafif meter, including the repetitions and alliterations I've color-coded here, I think you can see, with apologies to Rumi, who says he's birang here, literally without color. But he says, Vah shebirang lo binashan ke manam, he bedinam mara chanam ke manam. Oh, how nameless, how light I am, when will I see myself as I really am? Well, Rumi scholarship offers excellent insight into poetry's thematic, imagistic, and theological dimensions. It devotes much less attention to Rumi's unique poetic sound, the subject of only a few pages, for example, in Franklin Lewis's and Schimmel's important magisterial tones. But given that how a lyric says, what it says, is often at least as important as what it says, the sonic texture is paramount to the distinctive poetry of a poem like this. Take its repetition of a handful of vowel sounds and a pattern that partly continues across the opening hemistich, which I attempt to delineate visually in a transliteration. I won't try to sound that out for you. But To some extent, these vowel repetitions shouldn't be surprising, since modern Persian has, according to contrastive phonological analysis, 6 vowel sounds, unlike the unusually large number in English, often said to be between 15 and 22, depending on whether you include, say, Australian diphthongs in the number. Rumi's poem intensifies the vowel repetitions in Persian to set up a resonant echo and variation across hemistichs. As Amin Behbahani puts it, Rumi displays the strong vowel music of the Persian language. And as Christophe Virgo remarks, Rumi's poetry is pervaded with internal rhyme, more so than Persian poetry in general. Like other poets who stitch their verbal patterning to the sonic structure of the language in which they write, Rumi creates a sound texture that's unique to Farsi and irreproducible in English. Monorhyme, assonance, sonic repetition come more easily in Persian and seem less contrived, since the language is, after all, built around 3 different types of syllables, as you see here, whereas English has about 17. This is why, for example, traffic becomes in Persian terafik, or ski becomes ski, because you don't have those particular consonant vowel or double consonant vowel consonant patterns. So listen to the bait, loosely couplet about another one from the same poem about the key, again, the key term fanon, in which the words terminal open vowel echoes, almost enacting a fanon, like dissolution, and the swirling cadences and the paradoxical wordplay and internal rhyme on paw or foot or leg. And again, please excuse my rusty and inadequate Persian. Mishodam dar fanan chulmah bipa, in bipa ye pa davan ke manan. So something like annihilated, I'm foot free, leg free like the moon. Look at me racing, a fleet-footed, foot-free runner. You gather from the translation the word paw, and those who don't know Persian, in Persian means both leg and foot, and my kids find enormous hilarity in that. They keep saying, well, if you go to the doctor, you need to have just your foot removed, not your whole leg. What do you do? And I try to suggest there are ways of handling that. Anyway, so, but like other translators, I've tried to venture here a sonic stand-in or alliteration for the original's irreproducible sonority. As Twitty writes in introducing in her and Anvar's translation, listening to Anvar's recital of Rumi's Ghazals remind her that as translators, we're entering the realm of impossibility, richness of Rumi's sounds woven from a language that repeats its sounds and words with infinite subtle variations and glories in that. English just doesn't bend that way. It does not possess these beautifully detachable prefixes and suffixes, those rounded open sounds that permit each word to spill over into the next, interweaving in endless repetition. The laws and regularities of English are immediately different, no matter how or how far they're stretched. So Rumi's sonically resonant ghazal, it would seem to corroborate Pound's assertion of the untranslatability of melopea. The connotative wordplay of logopia, perhaps akin to Jahan in Perso-Arabic poetics, also infuses this ghazal and many others like it, though again, it's largely unrecreatable in English. So switching to an edition in which the Persian is more accurate, let's look at one last bait from this poem, maybe the hardest in this ghazal to render in English, which plays on ain, a loan word from Arabic that should qualify for a truly globalized dictionary of untranslatables, unlike Baba and Hassan. In Persian, it means I, same, spring, source, the best part of anything, essence, and as an adjectival nominative, ayan, the visible, obvious, manifest. Guftam ey jan, to ain amai, guf ain chedvad, taran ayan, kemana. So note here the unlikenesses of two excellent translations. Anvar and Twitty's reads I said, my soul, you're the light in my eyes. Where I am, he said, no need for eyes. Lewis's, Franklin Lewis's reads, I said, friend, you're just like me. He said, how can you speak of likeness to the obviousness I am? Are these even recognizable as translations of the same text? In the first hemistich, ain means eyes, but also my likeness, source, or essence. That is, soul, you are my eyes, but also you're the same as me, you are my essence or source. The second hemistich playfully counters the meaning of the first in asking, what would eyes be in this visibility where ion, this visibility everywhere, ion that manifests me. Or, again, the crude renditions I've tried. What's a hidden essence? Aim when the essence that I am hides in plain sight. Ion. So it's the paradoxical wordplay that's frequent in me, and that virtually dissolves in explanation. So many different connotations prance in what Pound calls logorrheia's dance of the intellect among words. Rumi's both more easily translated than many poets because of the homey soulfulness of his reflections, yet harder as well because of the symphonic layering of wordplay, sonic textures, and semantic content. Although for some years I've been tracing Anglophone poetry's travel and transnationalism, lyric poetry, at least of this kind, to the extent that it's embedded in the language of its articulation, may be in fact less mobile, at least in some of its dimensions, than emojis, pop songs, novels, or visual aesthetic forms such as those we track from Iran to Byzantium to Yeats's poems. So, having drawn attention to what's lost in their translation, even in a case like Rumi, where so much is gained, in my third section, I turn finally to Azal by Marvini's modern heirs, because it instances how even with these losses, the bridge of translation can provide visually important glimpses into certain aspects of the poetic, social, and historical imagination in other languages. Also partly in response to Persian ghazals, Goethe, an early proponent of Repetitur, wrote that translation, even when techniques like monorhyme, which he felt wasn't really suited to German, may not be suited to the target language, can give us access, he said, to the historical, fabulous, and ethical elements, the opinions and modes of thought of another culture or time. So contemporary Iranian poet Simin Behbahani might not seem promising, since the excellent English translation of her lyrics by Farzaneh Irani and Kaveh Safar concludes with a rigorous 44-page afterword that explains, ironically, all of the poems lose in translation. As they say, the original music and rhythms and geometry, generic extension and innovation, in the ghazal, elusiveness and intertextual friction, crunchiness or granularity of texture, shifting registers of diction, syntactic manipulations, revisions of Iran-specific symbolism, in short, the linguistic, musical, literary, cultural, social, and historical embeddedness of any poem. So what's left for you on that second? Such candor about translations' inescapable losses and mutilations, as they call it, paradoxically may provide the best foundation, perhaps, for valorizing the work of translation, where it illuminates the specificities of a writer's poetics and the resources of both the source and target languages. So is Behbahani's poem about the world is shaped like a sphere, or Zanin shaped glass, an example of world literature? What's the ratio of losses to gains here? We're casting the poem in English free verse. Milani and Safar have left aside refrain, rhyme, couplet structure, and internal china. But perhaps because Behbahani's melopea is more austere than Rumi's, her English Azal seems more adequate, suffused with her wit, vivid imagery, defiant boldness of address, and ironic turns of thought. Published in 1995, but written in 1981, when revolutionary Iran's hardening resistance to Restoxification, was resulting in the execution of thousands of leftists, including, indeed, a beloved first cousin of mine, Farshad Mirafdar, whose mother and siblings and family I'm visiting here in the Stanford area for the next couple of days. The poem allegorizes the violence that can come of simplistic East-West dichotomies, like those I began with in Yeats, whether emanating from East or West. As Farzaneh Irani writes, Behbahani, who was disillusioned by the revolution she had initially supported and was horrified by the reign of terror, had always resisted binary modes of thinking. Addressing the listener as a collaborator, the speaker of this poem literally deconstructs the Ghazal's first part, in its first part, the artificial directions and meanings we impose on the globe. A sphere has no left or right. Like a toy, it can be made to turn one way or another. So our agreement to call this the East, though we could push it west with ease. Rumi, who writes, I am neither of the East nor of the West, but from no place, la makan. The poem builds on the Quranic aversion to divisions of East and West, Surah 2:115, and warnings against exclusive adherence to East or West, Surah 2:177. Yet within this broadly Muslim context, one of the words Behbahani uses for globe is the emphatically Greek term Abbasid geographie, from the ancient god Atlas and the science of geography. Implicitly, those in Iran and elsewhere who harshly divide East from West ironically rely on a Western paradigm to do so. In this poem about binary division that itself divides in half, the world is seen as a corpse that is being devoured. The world, Jahan, is being divided by a line, so fate, is a dead body, Murdar, cut in two, on which the vulture and hyena are feasting. In a culture built around rituals of hospitality and cuisine, as Professor Ramazani mentioned, I'm particularly partial to the cuisine part because my mother published the first cookbook in English, Persian cookbook in English. The Shia practice, of course, also ritually washing, purifying the dead body, multiple ablutions is very much a part of the culture as well. This spectacle of predatory feasting on a corpse is all the more repulsive. Although some culturally specific resonances that are hard to convey in translation, much else lives in Iranian Safa's rendition, as I hope I've indicated. Behbahani's dual vision of the globe as free-spinning free-spinning sphere or as split moldering corpse. Her literalizing the idea of the division of the world as destruction, her grotesque images of hyena, vulture, flies, gleefully saving themselves on carrion, her taunting of the addressee for complicity in murder and in corpse-fed celebration, her tonal shift from collaborative engagement to defiance, from playfully toying with the world as directionless globe to fiercely witnessing the world's demise as carrion. These aspects of the poem, of this world poem, are as vivid in English translation as in Persian. Such examples should prompt us, I think, to have some caution about recent polemical arguments against world literature predicated on the assumption of untranslatability. This is kind of Apter's term. That said, because of the language specificity of much lyric poetry, its translation is uniquely challenging to the world literature as gained in translation model. In developing a more nuanced position than either the untranslatability thesis or the gains in translation model, I think it's worth consulting not only Pound, but also Roman Jakobson. He refused what he called the dogma of untranslatability, arguing that many different kinds of messages can be recoded from one language to another. But he also set poetry apart by virtue of how in it phonemic similarities such as punning among other verbal equations is sensed as a semantic relationship to the extent that poetry by definition is untranslatable and only creative transposition is possible. Nor is this idea exclusively Western. Consider, for example, that more than a millennium before Pound or Jakobson, the Abbasid critic Jahan in the middle of this says, poetry cannot be translated and does not render itself to transmission. Translation can never really succeed, writes Damrosch, if a work's meaning is taken to reside essentially in the local verbal texture of its original phrasing. Thus necessarily, that is this definition of world literature, necessarily excluding works such as Rumi's that we've been looking at, in which that local verbal texture is crucial. Unless we recast the model of world literature, lyric poems that intensifies the language's sonic and connotative properties, impeding their recreability in another language, will have difficulty finding a home here. You might have thought the challenges of translating poetry would be obvious, but at an MLA roundtable on translation this last January, I was astonished when two speakers dismissed the idea that it may be harder to translate a lyric poem than an instruction manual. This is in response to an annoying question from me. There's also a recent trend in translation studies to the effect of dismissing Frost's famous dictum that poetry is what's lost in translation. It's said to reflect an essentialist definition of poetry. Poems as richly embroidered in musical, lucid, and connotative threads as Rumi's or Yeats's, Yeats, who is said by James Natale to be entirely untranslatable, call into question claims that poetry is not a special case of language. Now, admittedly, Frost's aphorism, like any aphorism, simplifies. As we've seen, some aspects of poetry translate. This is all the truer of poems and long-form varieties, such, of course, as epic or narrative verbs, and even some lyrics, such as Miroslav Holub. Justin Quinn's estimation writes poems as translatable as science. It also depends, of course, on what languages are involved. Translate from, say, Persian into English is quite different from translating Persian into a closely related language like Urdu. Sometimes art and poetry that seem like walls turn out to be bridges. Sometimes they seem like bridges but turn out to be walls. But even walls-like impediments, such as the untranslatable elements of poetry, can turn into a bridge if instead of overlooking them, we examine the cultural specificities they render visible on either side. After all, we can only become aware of the special qualities of one language when we cross over into another. Grappling with linguistic and cultural difference through the act of translation crystallizes the affordances of the languages we speak. By virtue of heightening and stretching the sonnets and tactic, rhetorical, elusive, and other features of languages, poetry can provide a powerful lens for cross-cultural and interlingual understanding. Now, to the extent that it privileges translatability, the emergent field of world literature, dominated by the novel, translated in English and often faulted for its Eurocentrism, will continue to marginalize literatures in which lyric poetry has for centuries been the major genre of literary expression, as in many parts of Asia. And in a recent statement on lyric poetry, I cite a few entries that I want to bring up for you here from the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, the editor-in-chief, which is, of course, here with us at Stanford and here with us tonight, Lauren Green. Poetry permeates all aspects of Vietnamese life, for example, in this first quote, states one entry. And indeed, the composition of lyrics, as we know, was compulsory on civil in Hanoi. In my own version of such a civil service exam for a global age, I recently had my students on a round-the-world voyage on semester at sea write poems in forms such as the Vietnamese Lic Ba, en route to Vietnam, as well as ghazals in India, haiku and tanka in Japan, and so forth. While it's difficult to reproduce some features of a language in another, such fixed forms are indeed, at least partly, transmissible. And in that, they're more akin to visual forms I explored at the beginning of this talk with Yeats. Another entry in the Princeton Encyclopedia reminds us that poetry has long prospered this is the last quote here of the three, as the predominant mode of literary expression among those who speak and write in Arabic. And a show taped in Abu Dhabi since 2006 makes this point quite powerfully. Millions Poet, which has had an audience of up to 70 million people. Poet participants recite lyrics they've written to compete for a prize worth more than $1 million. I urge you to go to YouTube if you haven't looked at this before. It's remarkable to see the vote tallies for the individual contestants. So much for the idea, sometimes heard in the US Academy, that lyric poetry is dead or is an illusory construct of the West. You won't be surprised that I'm working my way up to a last entry about Persian poetry in the Princeton Encyclopedia, which has had, again, a remarkably tiny role in the study thus far of world literature. As the most prestigious form of verbal discourse and artistic expression in Persian culture, poetry is traditionally the privileged form of verbal discourse and the preferred vehicle for the transmission of wisdom and knowledge. So when I lived for a year in Iran as a schoolboy, I was astonished when even relatives of very humble means could finish one another's quotations of medieval lyric poems. Even with TV and electronic media, the tradition still lives. On a Persian poetry TV game show, you can watch a first grader named Aha performing brilliantly as a contestant in a popular game, Mushaire, in which the player takes the last letter, one form of it, the last letter of a previous person's quotation, and begins another quotation with the same letter. In another such game, she instantly responds to the prompts of Persian words for flame, poppy, wind, with a classic couplet that includes them.
کار تو با کودک فتاد چون سر و کار تو با کودک فتاد پس زبان کودکی باید گشاد به عزیزم
دردا که از آن آهوی مشکین سیه چشم چون ناف بسی خون دلم در جگر افتاد
باریکلا آفرین بر شما یه بار دیگه هم تکرار خون قشنگی می‌کنی
دردا که از آن آهوی مشکین سیه چشم چون ناف بسی خون دلم در جگر افتاد همش نومید چون واقف نی از سر غیبات شدم در پرده بازی ها که پنهان غم نخور
آفرین بر شما آفرین یک کمی هم باید بخندی وقتی شعر آفرین آفرین
از شما واژه بعد شعله
برای شماره 1 رها خانم
آتش نیست که از جبهه او سوزد شم آتش آن است که در خرمن پیغام نزدم
من که گفتی درسته بسیار
متشکریم
می‌پذیرید
واژه بعد دوستان دقت بفرمایید شقایق
بعد شماره 1
ارغوان جام عقیقی به سمن خواهد داد چشم نرگس به شقایق نگران خواهد شد
بسیار خوب بسیار خوب
متشکریم واژه بعد دقت کنید باد
بعد شماره 1
نفس باد سبا موج فشان خواهد شد عالم پیر دیگر باره جوان خواهد شد
بسیار خوب بسیار خوب
واژه بعد نسترن
بله نسترن
میگذریم از این واژه
بله
واژه بعد باغ
بله دختر شماره 1
گر من از باغ تو یک میوه بچینم چه شود پیش پاکی به چراغ تو ببینم چه شود
متشکریم اصلا درست تقریبا همزمان با رها ولی با کسر ثانیه اختلاف چراغش رو روشن میکنه ولی نمیشه چراغش روشن نمیشه باید اینقدر زودتر بهشون میبرم
Just wonderful, trying to console the other contestants. Hard act to follow, but I just conclude here quickly with returning one last time to an image of the world's most famous wall that's also a bridge, a reminder of how global cultures have been connected and divided in myriad ways for thousands of years. And I'd like to return one last time to Edward Said, whose pronouncement seems to me no less relevant than it was 20 years ago and deserves to be iterated. It says, the fact is we are mixed in with one another in ways that most national systems of education have not dreamed of. To match knowledge and arts and sciences with these integrated realities is, I believe, the intellectual and cultural challenge of the moment. So world literature may have a part to play in meeting that challenge, provided it's grounded in language-sensitive, comparative poetics. The world of world literature needs to be large enough to encompass and render visible both the translatables and untranslatables of lyric poetry. And humanistic study needs to be more attentive to the east-west crossings and blockages of migrant aesthetic forms. Whether the flows of culture are smooth or bumpy, easy or difficult, full or partially impeded, the transnational humanities can help remind us that for all the difficulties of engaging one another across cultural and linguistic lines, we're more intricately interconnected, even in our differences, than the wall centuries would have us believe. Because poetry's ear is pressed close against the hum of the languages that make us fully human, it may have a role to play in both calibrating and crossing our divisions.